Because for the most part, people in entertainment were civil. They weren't trying to preach messages to you. They talked about things that are often debated and discussed, but they didn't really take sides on issues, or they didn't make issues out to be as black and white as they were. There was not a push for this is the right way to think. There was just, this is how the two groups of people think. And most episodes of TV shows weren't centered around a central theme other than just to entertain the viewer and to tell stories that entertain the viewer. You know, it wasn't about we need to elevate these people and lower these people. It was about here's the story, here's the characters presented, you enter into this experience. That's what it used to be about. You enter into this experience. There was no social media. You know, there were cell phones, but not everybody had them, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s, like 97 to 2000, 2001. There were more focus on landlines and collect calling than there was on just using a cell phone. Cell phones existed, but they were stupidly expensive. The plans were expensive. You could only talk for so long. It was a totally different ball game than what we have today with smartphones. It was completely different. So people were not nearly as connected as they are today. So they weren't constantly engaging in stimulation of the mind and conversation. They were disconnecting from each other, and our minds weren't constantly being stimulated, other than maybe you could argue with television. Broadcast television was at its peak. I mean, there was always something on. It's hilarious to me that we used to complain that there was nothing on, because when you look back, there was all sorts of stuff on. It's just we had grown so accustomed to things that they became mundane and boring, so we were just frustrated at our boredom. But today, there really is nothing on because broadcast TV has been abandoned for streaming, which is a horrific mistake. There's a difference between broadcast television and streaming, and I've talked about this multiple times, and I'll talk about it again because I feel passionate about it. Broadcast television is an experience. It's like going to a theater. You've got your bumpers, you've got your ads, and then you've got your programs, and you've got programming blocks. You know, you've got a conglomeration of all types of programming. And no, it's not immediately on demand to where you can pick and choose which ones you want to watch and which ones you don't. But you have an easier time of discovering something that you otherwise wouldn't watch because it looks appealing to you. You catch a brief scene visually, you're like, huh, what's going on here? And then you want to follow along with the storyline. It's very deliberate and it's by design so that when you're scrolling through television, you know, you might see something that interests you. And then with the advent of digital cable towards the mid-2000s, you started to see TV guides so you could understand a little bit more about the programming. It was a great companion. You didn't have to buy the TV Guide magazine to figure out what was going on. I don't even know if they still make the TV Guide magazine. But you could wait and see what was, you know, you could start to see what was on. But the internet was still in its infancy, and there was a lot of TV was pushing a lot of people towards online for more information on stuff, and there was no real social media. It didn't say follow our Facebook page, like our Instagram. It was just go to www. Remember putting in the full web address? You know, you just go to the website and find more information. But you didn't live online. In fact, with early dial-up, you couldn't be online for too long because it tied up the phone lines and it cost money and all of that. So people weren't as connected as they used to be, and that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes people need to disconnect from each other. When you feel like you have to be communicating with people 24/7, you get into this mode of just burnout. And when you're hearing news from all over the place, if you're hearing worldly news, I've often said, and this was something in the late 90s, early 2000s that started, but 24-hour cable news networks are a crime against humanity. Because we don't need to be hearing 24/7 about all the bad things happening in the country and in the world. If I'm living in, say, Florida, I don't need to be hearing about the bad things that happened in Oregon. I just don't. I don't need to be hearing about that. It doesn't do anything for me other than say, wow, the world is less safe of a place. I should be more paranoid. I should be more angry. I should be more frustrated. We've got an entire generation of people who grew up with 24-hour cable news networks, with social media, with constant stimulation of the mind, constantly hearing about bad things happening in the world, even though they're all from different periods and different, you know, different periods of time, different locations. It's all conglomerated and it's all pushed right into your face. And so people end up looking at that stuff and they end up just, their mind completely melts. It starts to just resemble a fried egg. You know, their mind is just absolutely baked like that anti-drug commercial. And they don't know how to disconnect because it's all they know. They need to keep their mind stimulated lest they get bored, because boredom used to be a thing we dealt with late 90s, early 2000s. We're bored, okay, we'll go out and do something. We'll go out and play. You can't go out and play anymore because you have to worry about somebody rolling up in a van and abducting you. It's just, my parents were like, I can't believe how much you have to worry about these days. We used to go everywhere as kids. My parents grew up in the 50s and 60s, so they could go wherever they wanted, basically. As long as they came home at a certain time, they didn't have to worry about even being abducted. You know, the world's objectively a worse place when you have to worry about your kid's safety more than you did 50, 60 years ago. It's it's really nuts. It really is. It's really crazy. But I do remember the time. I was very young in the late 90s, early 2000s. I was just in elementary school, and I remember so much innocence. And then 9/11 happened, and that was sort of the first sign of a societal decline. But it still showed there was a sense of unity in America. People came together. They kind of all stopped what they were doing to come together to mourn, to pray, to gather together and to stand resolute as a country, because once it became clear it was an act of terror, they said we said we will not submit to terror. We will stand strong as a nation, and we will keep pressing forward through the midst of this horrific tragedy, but we won't let anybody push us around. It's when we showed strength and unity as a nation. Now we're more divided than ever before. States are talking about seceding, and counties are starting to talk about seceding from states because the ideologies are so at war with each other, and policies are being implemented that people on other sides don't want, and it's just an absolute mess, an absolute mess. But back then, we still realized that when push comes to shove, we need to come together as a nation, and we need to do what is right, and that's what we did post 9/11. Of course, things went back to how they usually were as time wore on, but I remember subsequent years after that, there was always something big for 9/11. There was always a big time of remembrance. Everybody stopped what they were doing just to remember this tragedy. Now people barely do anything for it. Barely anything at all, because there's entire generations of kids who have been born who are in the social media sphere and everything else that they have no connection to it. They hear about it. It's like Pearl Harbor. It's kind of like what happened with Pearl Harbor. That's the nature of tragedies. In some ways, it's a good thing because it shows we can move forward and not have to lament this every time. But we need to remember that these times when we're vulnerable. But I really just miss the era because there wasn't one of these in your pocket at all times. This would have been a flip phone, and it was for communication for the people who you were with whenever you went out in public. It was to let people know where you were and to make plans with people, do what you did over the landline, but you could just do it anywhere. It was more convenient. And then text messaging came on the scene. I remember how controversial text messaging used to be. Oh, people are texting too much. They're texting all the time. And then that gave way eventually to social media and social media messaging and all of that. And it just, I had a friend who would never text. He would never send messages because it was, his sister was so obsessed with it that they felt like it just turned her into a zombie, How different things have changed. I mean, there was still stuff we complained about back then. Texting was on the rise, the internet was on the rise, and people were concerned about websites and about being online because people were concerned with television. As good as television were, there were people saying, oh, it's going to rot your brain and it's terrible because all kids are watching are these stupid cartoons and these stupid sitcoms, and they're not doing anything productive. And it was very easy to ignore those complaints because they were coming from just sort of like mommy blogs and magazine articles, and a lot of that hasn't changed today in terms of it's really funny. A lot of independent journalism, in a sense, hasn't changed. Some of those rage bait articles, they've been doing those since magazines. It's kind of hard to fathom, but we tend to think a lot of this is new because we just weren't paying attention to it because it was in books and magazines we never read. But with the internet, everything's being shoved in your face. So you're hearing about something all the time, either from somebody you follow or whatever. We're being exposed to way more than we were before. Things are way too centralized. We need to start decentralizing things, you know? The part of the problem is we doom scroll when we're having a bad day at work. We come home, we're supposed to decompress, enjoy entertainment, but instead of enjoying entertainment, we doom scroll. We constantly scroll through and look at news headlines, and we go, oh geez, the world is such a freaking terrible place. It's just awful. I don't want to be a part of this world anymore. And we just get depressed and despondent and just completely black-pilled. We just keep scrolling and keep scrolling, and it's just like it never ends. So I've made a conscious effort myself to try and break away from news, break away from political news, because I got into political news for a long time and decided it's not worth it because politics is just a frustrating zero-sum game. It's just more and more corruption and problems no matter what side you're on, even if they're people who you agree with philosophically. It's all motivated by money. So trying to break away from all that, occasionally looking at what's going on for the sake of my own future and society, but not getting too hung up on it. I think I completely burned out in January of this year. I've never had real anxiety before, at least not to a crippling degree. I've had anxiety, but for the first time in my life in January of 2023, I dealt with a crippling anxiety, the likes of which I've never experienced. I don't know what brought it on, but I was worried about death. I was worried about life simultaneously, and it was like I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. I was just staring at stuff. So I was like, oh my goodness, everything is a mess. Everything is horrible. Everything sucks. And I needed to be reminded that I'm alive. I'm still breathing. You know, God was the one who showed me. He said, you're still alive. You're waking up every day. You're breathing. You've got a roof over your head. You've got a loving family. You don't need to be anxious about the future because you can't control the future. Much like you can't control the past. You live each day one at a time, you know. You got to learn to enjoy the moments you're in. But I do miss the late 90s and early 2000s because of the sense of civility and humanity. And it feels like we're losing that humanity, but there is a silver lining to where we're at today, which is a lot of people are feeling like I am, and they're breaking away from the social media stranglehold. They're shutting down their social media, or they're using it sparingly. They're using it as it was originally intended. They're learning how to do that as opposed to just falling into an addiction with social media. Here's the best way to approach social media. I want to say this for people watching and they feel burnt out by social media. Don't just delete your accounts unless you feel like you absolutely just need to get rid of all of it and you just can't handle seeing any of it. That's fair. Some people are like that, okay? That's fine. But if you're going to have a presence on social media, make a post. If you feel it's worth posting, post it. Move on with the rest of your day. Don't keep your notifications on who respond to it, whatever. Don't focus on how many likes, how many whatever it gets. Just post it and move on. Post something else, move on, and just let it sit where it might. Don't start going back, taking stuff off, and being like, "Oh, I'm not confident in this because it's not doing well." Leave it alone. Because you're by doing that, and this is something people don't understand, by going back to a social media post and deleting it because you feel it's not getting enough attention, you're feeding into that zeitgeist of I'm only doing this for attention. You're doing this to share you. You're not doing this to get praise. If you do it to get praise, you're doing it wrong. That's what I always do with my YouTube videos, with my Rumble videos, with anything that I do. I just put it out there. Even if I don't feel 100% confident in it, I put it out there and I leave it alone. And if it gets comments, if it gets likes, occasionally I'll respond to it, but I usually leave it alone. Then when I do come back to it, I'm surprised to see if it does good, if it does bad. It doesn't matter to me. I just do it because I enjoy it. That's what social media needs to be. And to do that, you need to be able to disconnect from it and move on to other things. If you can't move on to other things, then you've got a problem. You're probably addicted to it. And you need to break away because you're constantly trying to get attention and praise, and you're doing things that are destroying your humanity in order to get the praise and adoration of people around you, some of which you don't even know. It's not healthy for you. So you need to break away from that. Okay, there's this healthy way to use social media, but you've got to reduce it. If you can't reduce it, then you've got to outright delete it. You know, that's part of our problem. In the late 90s, early 2000s, we had blogs and we had forums. You can go back and find forums that are still running from them. You can find old boards from back in the early days, and you'll see a lot of similar stuff to today. It's actually kind of funny to see what people were complaining about is very similar to what people were complaining about today, but that's because mankind's nature just doesn't change. It stays the same no matter what era you're in. But it was not like it is today. People didn't. I mean, there were a couple of people who had a real problem and they lived off these forums, but it wasn't the majority of people like it is today. It was a whole separate culture. There were problems back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Boy, were they. I just mentioned 9/11. There was the Enron scandal. There was all sorts of financial ups and downs, and there was the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Oh man, there were problems, but people were still more connected, more unified in stronger communities than they are today. Things have been wildly divided thanks to social media, thanks to an onslaught of news, thanks to even entertainment is ideological and political because it's engaging in one side of a culture war, which is not healthy. You know, one thing I've done is I've gone back and watched old media. That's primarily all I watch. I don't watch anything new other than YouTube stuff from independent people that I like. And even then, people that I really like, I've had to disconnect from because they get political, even politically that I agree with. I'm like, no, I don't want to engage it because it's just a battle. You're going to get pushback from people, and I don't want to fight with people all the time. I decided that when I was 17, 18 years old, and I got into a couple social media spats with people. I'm like, I'm not doing this anymore. I don't know these people. I have no reason to be upset with these people because I don't know them. I don't know the totality of their life or why they choose to believe what they do. I don't know where their life is going to end up years from now. I don't know these people. Why am I investing time in them? It's not worth it. Just to feel like you have a sense of community? That's not community. That's a mess, is what that is. So yeah, I do that. I disconnect. I go back to old media. I just recently started watching I Love Lucy, which is a lot of fun because it's on Pluto TV. So I've been watching a couple of episodes of that. They're not all hits, but they're fun. It's just innocent fun. But people would look at that and say that by the nature of it being old, oh, this was racist, this was sexist, this was blah, 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 blah. I don't care about any of that. It was just a good TV show. It's a beloved TV show. It's fun. It's entertainment. Do you remember what that is? Stop trying to make everything into a political or ideological battle and start enjoying things again. That's part of the problem with new media. Something comes out that's made to be just pure fun, and you'll get a Salon or a Vice or a Kotaku article talking about, here's why this show that everybody likes is terrible. People are tired of that. They're done with it. They don't read those articles. That's why those websites are going in the toilet. And they did that back with magazines too. I mean, it wasn't as crazy as it was, but people found reasons to complain, and they were hired to basically complain. People don't want that anymore. They just want a way to decompress from the difficulties of their day-to-day responsibilities. They don't want to have to go and hear on the news, tornado in Mississippi killed 25 people, which was something that happened recently. It wasn't 25 people, but it was a lot of people who live all the way in Maine. People in Maine don't want to hear about that. Not that it's not tragic, not that people don't need to hear that it happened, but the news just dwells on tragedy because they need that viewership, and it's scummy, it's evil, because you're telling people the world is a worse place than it actually is. Bad things are happening over here, so everything must be terrible. That's the mentality that seeps into our brains the way that they do it. Got to disconnect from that. I'm not saying don't ever read news headlines. I mean, you want to have some sense of being informed, but for crying out loud, disconnect and don't watch the 24-hour news networks. Don't watch MSNBC. Don't watch Fox. Don't watch Newsmax. Don't watch CNN. Don't watch Russia Today. Don't watch insert network here. In fact, I'd be careful about watching more than once a day your local NBC, ABC, or CBS affiliate, because they're starting to take the same formula that the 24-hour news networks are taking, and they're talking more about global news when they should be talking about good news in the area mostly. You know, news is I think the saying is any news is good news, and that's how they approach it, but it's not healthy for you to be consuming copious amounts of bad news. Trust me, it affects your psyche. It's affected me for many years. And for the first time in a long time, in 2020, in this half of 2023, I'm devoting myself to cutting myself off from as much of that as possible. You know, even in entertainment, you know, I've engaged in the culture war. I've taken a side in the culture war, but I'm starting to step back because nothing is changing. I mean, some things are slightly changing, but it's more energy than it's worth when I can just go back and watch old media and enjoy it, you know. Like I said, I've been watching stuff like I Love Lucy. I watched Garfield and Friends because I'm a big Garfield fan. I didn't remember that much from when I was a kid. You know, I started watching all sorts of old Nicktoons and Cartoon Network shows like Dexter's Lab and Codename Kids Next Door, and then, even Disney stuff that I can find. I just watch what was fun and takes me back to a time of more innocence to disconnect, because I've got enough problems with my own responsibilities in the world. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I had my own responsibilities as a kid, but the entertainment was great. It wasn't really ideological. Every once in a while, like, you'd get a That's So Raven episode where they deal with racism. That was one time out of the entire series, and it was handled more tactfully. You can argue whether or not they should have done it. I think personally it could have gone either way. But it wasn't like today where it's like that's the central theme of the stinking show. They deal with issues every once in a great while if they can find a creative way to write them in and not feel like they're beating somebody over the head with it. They do things that are right. Nowadays, it's just ideology comes first, everything else second. No, entertainment has to come second. And that's where people are walking away and saying no. And thankfully, people are walking away from social media. There's talk of this whole TikTok ban and the controversy surrounding it. But even besides that, people are just saying, I'm done with social media. It's killing my brain. So I want to have a healthier state of mind. And the only way I can do that is by either doing what I did and approaching social media with a sense of, I don't want to, how do I put this? They approach social media with a sense of, why can't I think straight? I don't understand what's going on. They approach social media by setting it and forgetting it and just leaving it alone, just posting it and leaving it alone and moving on to other things, not constantly scrolling, trying to figure out what everybody else is doing at once, but focusing on the people who are positive for them to focus on, and not trying to constantly get attention, just putting stuff out there because you enjoy something, you want to share something, and just let people do what they want. I used to be on Instagram all the time. I had to break away from that because I was getting obsessed with how many people are liking this, how many people are commenting this. And then I caught myself going, you idiot. Why do you care? Just leave it and forget it. Or then I would start deleting posts thinking, oh, well, this one wasn't very good. People obviously didn't like this because they didn't respond to it. No, that's not the case at all. It's more and more people are breaking away from social media, spending less time on it. So people aren't quickly responding as much, as time goes on. You're not constantly getting that dopamine hit of like, comment, like, and all that nonsense. So you got to break away from that because it becomes addictive, and we're having an entire generation of kids who are just addicted to that from the cradle, and it's not good. It's not good at all. They need to learn balance, and they need to learn to break away outright and do other things. Like in the late 90s, early 2000s, we used to go out and rollerblade. We used to skate. We used to ride our bikes, play basketball. We used to go to roller rinks. We used to go to bowling alleys, which are still around, by the way. People need to take advantage of that. We used to go out to parks and do all sorts of park activities, walk our dogs. We used to do all sorts of things. And now we've reduced so many things to being at home on the internet, and that's not healthy for us. I miss stuff like Blockbuster, where you could go out. It wasn't just about going out and renting a physical movie. That's a strong part of it. But you were also connecting with people who might have had similar interests in a more generic way, in a more authentic way, rather than on the internet where it's just text on a screen. You were actually having real in-person conversations about that given thing. There was a sense of community, even with complete strangers, even if it never went beyond anything. It made people feel better about the society they were living in. We need to get back to that sort of thing. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. What are your memories of the late 90s, early 2000s, if you have any? What were some memories of better times that you had, and how you think as a society we need to get back to those times? Thank you very much for watching. This has been Super Koopa TV with another Koopa Talks, and I will see you guys next time. God bless. Have a good one. Peace.